Hey y'all, so we're back with another episode of Poli-Side-Eye with my co-host Jared. So update them on how you've been. I know you have something big coming up on June 3rd.
Yes, I'm defending my dissertation on June 3rd, so next Friday. And if you're not familiar with the process, for people who are getting their PhD, the defense is the opportunity for you to essentially present your research in front of your dissertation committee. And upon completion of that, you will officially be a doctor. So yeah, I'm super excited about that because I've been working in this PhD for 6 years. Been working in the dissertation in particular for about 4 years. So it's nice to see the culmination of it. So yeah, I'm excited about doing that and just, on to the next.
So it's going to be Dr. Clemens.
It will. Well, I don't care about titles and that type of stuff. So, but I guess technically, yes, it will be.
He's so humble, y'all. I would change my screen name, everything. Like you will call me Doctor. And what's the topic again?
So the name of my dissertation is The Privatization of Racial Responsibility, a materialist analysis of contemporary white anti-racist under neoliberal capitalism. So I essentially, in a nutshell, I tried to offer a theoretical account of why it is that many white people are inclined to do shit like put Black Lives Matter signs in their front lawns instead of, let's say, agitating for more structural improvements to combating inequality. And so I trace this historical story about how transformations in political economy have essentially produced that kind of behavior. So when I started working on my dissertation, it was kind of in the backdrop of Black Lives Matter, kind of making me think about what does it mean that all these white people are going to these protests and stuff. But at the end of the day, like they're still sending their kids to, white schools and living in these secluded white neighborhoods and stuff with their Black Lives Matter signs. And so I wanted to provide a way of thinking about that wasn't just, wasn't all just about kind of the emotions of the process, or try to not turn it into like this moral thing, but actually look at it from a political economic standpoint and show that there are real structural reasons why those types of behaviors tend to occur. And so it's kind of a historical narrative in a sense, but I also pull together like data and other stuff to kind of make my point. But that's it in a nutshell. But the dissertation itself is almost 300 pages. So obviously this is a very small subset of like the broader project.
Well, okay. Well, I can't wait to be on Zoom. I can't wait to be on Zoom to witness this and to hear it. But yes, y'all, so our topic for today is something that just inspired me when I saw it on Twitter. So it was a tweet talking about millennials. And if you didn't know, they were born 1981 to 1996, so ages 26 to 41. Basically, the tweet was saying, I feel for millennials, not just because I am one, but because we truly spent our adolescence doing the things we were supposed to do in preparation for a world that no longer exists. And it's been a shit show ever since. It resonated with me. I was one of those millennials that was taught, oh, well, go to college, you'll get the job, you'll get the paycheck, you'll be living comfortably. It did not work like that. When I graduated during a recession. All these jobs, they needed like at least all this experience. I'm like, well, I had to work waiting tables during college. So like, what experience y'all want me to have? And I just thought everything was set up for me if I just did the right thing. And that's just not how it went.
Yeah. So I think to really think about that, you have to think about when it was that millennials were born and the type of society that they were being born into. So most of us were born in the 80s, early 90s, and that was a very tumultuous period economically. So coming out of the 70s, the US, let me pause for a second and say that it's really interesting seeing how people talk about inflation now, because so many of the issues that we're talking about now are similar issues that were being debated and confronted at the end of the 70s and the early 80s. And so I think it's important to think about that, because one thing that we know about capitalism is that it's cyclical. So we hear like the term booms and busts. That is inherent in capitalism. Like you can't avoid that. But so much of what political leaders try to do is essentially try to avoid what capitalism requires, which are these booms and busts. And so I just wanted to put that out because I think it's important to think about how these things revolve. So most of us were born in the 80s and 90s during a time where, if we've talked about it on this show a million times before, like Ronald Reagan as president, one of the things that he oversaw was pretty much a dismantling of what people call the social welfare state. And so for decades, it had been the case that political leaders understood what I just said, which is that capitalism is prone to booms and busts. And so as a result, part of the reason we ended up with all of these social programs that were passed in the 40s and the 50s and 60s, so thinking about Social Security, thinking about Medicare, all of those things, Pell Grants, like I know many of people got those. All of this was passed during an era in which most political leaders understood that if you just let capitalism do its thing, like it was going to fuck over too many people. So they put into place these mechanisms to at least put a baseline beneath people to where maybe if they weren't able to get a job that paid them quite enough, you had these programs that could essentially step in and help people when they needed it. When Reagan comes into office, he's like, fuck all that. I'm not going to be supporting these welfare queens anymore. So he, in his administration, slash pretty much most of these social programs. So that's important because if you think about where we are now, we don't live in a society in which there's a strong social welfare state. And largely that's because Reagan made it his job really to dismantle all of that. And so as a result, what ends up happening to education? Education takes on a much more important place in the economy because people understand that if they don't have anything to fall back on vis-a-vis like government programs, then they got to really bust their ass and make sure they get a good education and make sure that their kids are in places to get good education so that they can market themselves to future employers and get a bigger salary and all those other things that we learned. Well, the issue with that is that, again, capitalism requires at least some inequality. Part of the reason it requires inequality is because that inequality is the way that capitalists are able to essentially exploit people. So if everybody could have access to a good paying job, then how would capitalists be able to pay people substandard wages? In as a result, how would they be able to make profits? So capitalists have an incentive to make sure that there's at least some unemployment at all times. Like that's you can learn all this stuff if you take like a basic like macroeconomics class. It's pretty standard. Which most people don't, which is the point. Like, right. But if you take like basic economics 101, like you'll learn all this stuff. Like it's not a secret. Long story short, most of us were born into an economy in which the government, led by Reagan, but not exclusively, decided that people needed to fend for themselves because welfare queens were sucking up all of our tax dollars, our being white people's tax dollars. So this was very much racialized. But we still ended up with a system that is still prone to boom. Look, the booms and the busts didn't go away. So now we have an economy that's prone to booms and busts. But instead of having these systems that help people when they need it, it's just if the economy busts, like you're on your own, which is what we've seen over the last, let's say, 2 or 3 decades. Like we see these, that's what 2007, 2008 was. It was a bust largely in real estate markets that had implications for everybody across the country. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was what was called a dot-com bust. So because of this rapid expansion of the internet and firms associated with the internet, that's when that bubble burst rather, which again, these things are going to happen. Like you can't avoid it. Like what does it do? It essentially takes down the economy with it. And the people who are taken down are usually the ones who have the least wealth or at least able to essentially weather that storm. And so I think millennials feel the brunt of that because we are the generation that by and large has less of the things that they need to essentially make it through these cycles, these downward cycles, I should say. And so part of the reason the millennials really feel like they've gotten the short end of the stick or a bad deal, which is true, is because we were born into a country that had by and large decided that social programs and things to help people were no longer that's not something that the government should be doing anymore.
The rule of thumb I can say is capitalism guarantees booms and busts. Always.
That's happened throughout history. You can go back to the 19th century in particular was one of the most volatile centuries for capitalism. Like there were booms and busts pretty almost yearly. It was really bad. So I say all that to say that people know this. The people running the economy know this. So Joe Biden knows this. People in Congress know this. People in the federal, they know that capitalism does this. So they're always devising ways to essentially make it so that not too many people get harmed by the bust. But they know that some people are going to get harmed regardless, and they don't really care. It's just they're kind of like, whoops, well, can't really do anything about that.
Getting back to millennials, I just want to talk about some characteristics that are put on millennials, stereotypes. I know it's been said that we complain a lot, and I think it's justified that we should complain. We're lazy, like we don't work as hard as the people that came before us. You know, if you just work hard, you work harder, less sleep. Sleep is for the weak, you know,
rising
to be successful. Do you know any other characteristics?
You say we're entitled? I hear that a lot.
Entitled, yes. Do you think it's warranted?
I mean, so what's really going on here is the baby boomers got theirs. And then once they got theirs, they were like, fuck y'all. And essentially were like, why y'all not getting y'all money up? When they literally pulled the rug from beneath everybody that came after them. I mean, part of it is not really their fault. Like there were some things that were by and large outside of the control of, let's say, what rank and file Americans were doing. Like we had a number of issues with, there was like a whole energy crisis in the 1970s that caused all types of problems. So, I mean, part of it, again, I don't want to lay the blame at like just kind of our parents, but to some extent, what's going on is that they happen to be a product. Like I said, when we first started, we are a product of the economy that we were born into. They are a product of the economy that they were born into. They were born into an American economy that in the mid 20th century, so in the 40s, 50s, 60s, by the early 70s, it was starting to crumble a bit, but people hadn't quite recognized what was going on yet. But they were born during an era in which government did a lot for people. And not only did they do a lot for people, but a lot of what it did was kept from people. So people got these cheap home loans. They got, you know, these low cost education, all that shit. But really, the government is subsidizing a lot of that, but they aren't telling people this. So people think that they are getting all of these things solely through their own hard work, instead of the fact that government is structuring an economy specifically so that people can attain these things at low cost, these things being homes, educations, and so forth. The people who are part of the baby boomer generation who are able to have a middle class life for themselves now look at us like, well, we did this, so why can't you? But part of the reason they don't see that the hand we were dealt is not the same is because a lot of the programs that the government implemented in the mid 20th century, it was done kind of, I don't want to say it wasn't hidden per se, but they didn't explain to people how they were in fact getting government assistance. And so now government assistance is just viewed as something that only Black people get because we have decades of essentially racist rhetoric that equates government assistance with laziness and people who are unwilling to work hard and all the other stuff. And now you can't like reverse and tell people like, hey, you know, the house you got, like it's really because the government subsidized it, because, you know, that's like telling a 70-year-old person that Santa Claus doesn't exist when they thought for all of their life that Santa Claus existed. It's just like, I mean, think about that. Like, when you found out that Santa Claus didn't exist, you were like distraught for a second. You're like, wow, like I really the last like 9 or 10 years of my life were a lie. Imagine telling all of these older Americans now that essentially all of these things they got was because the government to a large degree subsidized a lot of it. They'd be like, wow, like my whole life has been a lie. And so I think that there's just an ideological component there that I think you have to consider.
If a baby boomer came to me and was just like, ragging on millennials, can I just say, y'all had a safety net? I didn't. Like, I can't take a risk. Like, I had to go to college to make sure I made money from this degree, unfortunately. Like, I feel like millennials didn't have the safety net that boomers had.
No, they absolutely didn't.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think calling that out or calling attention to that it's not like it's an affront to the person. Like, it's a verifiable fact. Like, it's true. Like, there's been tons of stuff written about how social programs have been essentially cut to the bare bones over the last 3 or 4 decades. So nothing about that is wrong. And so I don't see why calling it out is a problem. One other thing I do want to mention that I forgot to mention is also the importance of debt. There's another kind of problem with capitalism, which is that capitalists don't want to pay their workers. They want to pay their workers as least amount they can. But the workers are also the people that need to buy the products that they produce. So what happens if you pay your employees pennies, then who's going to buy all of these products that you are churning out? Workers are not just workers, they're also consumers. And so you need people to consume the products that they're producing, essentially. And so one way out of that was debt. They're like, well, we won't pay people more, but we'll give them credit cards. And so that'll make up for what they otherwise would have been getting in wages. And so that's partially why there's been such an explosion in household debt over the past 4 decades. But not only credit card debt, also mortgage debt, so also auto debt, student loan debt, pretty much anything that has to stand in for the wages that people otherwise would have been getting if their employers paid them more. Like, that's been the function of debt over the past 4 or 5 decades. And so I think that's an important thing to consider, because many of us being millennials, are heavily indebted, whether that's credit card debt or student loan debt or whatever. We're indebted because most of us aren't getting paid nearly what we need to be getting paid to actually live in this economy, especially one that is heavily inflated right now. And so I think it's kind of crazy to then blame people for being indebted whenever, what other choice do they have? If it's a choice between putting food on the table or starving, then you're going to put food on the table, even if that means you have to take out debt to do so. And we know how debt it functions. Like, there's usually high interest rates and all these other things. So it's predatory as well. And so that is something else our generation has had to contend with that, let's say, our parents' generations didn't.
Okay. So what are some advantages that we as millennials have?
Good question. So one advantage, I think, is not necessarily a tangible one, but more so thinking about ideas. So I think for a number of millennials, the facade of capitalism has been lifted. The fact that we could even have this discussion now, I think we take for granted, because this type of discussion would not have been taking place 20 years ago, at least not on a regular basis. So I think there's a growing segment of us that recognizes that something is not right. We may not be able to put into words what's wrong, but we know that something in the water ain't clean. So much of capitalism for most of the late 20th century was all what some scholars call a dose of capitalist realism. Like, there is no other way, like, this is the way it is, like, you're just kind of accepting it. And I think now you're starting to see growing segments of people saying, like, no, like, we need to do something differently. So I think when you see all of these people at Starbucks organizing to unionize, or at Amazon and all these other places, I think that is an indication that there are enough people recognizing in our generation, because it's mainly younger people, so millennials and Gen Z, I think they recognize that shit's fucked up. Now we have to figure out something to do. The issue is that most people are starting to recognize that things are going wrong, but that recognition is not necessarily lending itself to productive politics. So I think of it as like 2 sides. So I would say there's a set of the population who will just put their head in the sand and pretend that nothing's wrong, but most people know that something's wrong. So on one side, you get people who are trying to fight for a better, more equitable world. And then you get some people who are just reacting. And so those are the folks who are going towards the far right, like people who just want to blow it all up, but largely because they don't understand that they're actually fucking themselves up too. And so the question is, which side is going to be able to dominate the discussion? Is it going to be the side who's trying to change things for the better? Or is it going to be people on the right who also are pissed off about the rent being too damn high and inflation and all that? But rather than reckoning with what's really going on, which is that capitalism is a fucked up system that is destroying itself and us in the process, they are then saying, well, what we really need to do is make sure that men know how to be men, women know how to be women, the gay agenda is stopped, and we don't have any Mexicans coming across the border. And so I think the question is like, how can we, there's an opportunity, which is that there's an opening, but the question is like, which side is gonna seize the opening first?
You know, it sounded like you were giving an allegory for the Matrix. It felt like you were saying like, oh, okay, well, we're now aware that we're in the Matrix. So what do we do about it? Either like, you know, this is fine, you know, we're in a house, a burning house, or we're going to do something about it and try to get out of it.
I think that's pretty much where we are. And so I would say that there is another segment. So there's three components. So there's the, oh, this is fine, like the dog meme in the burning house. There's that. There are the people who are like, okay, shit, the house is burning. Okay, there is a door here. We can figure out, if we work together, we can figure out how to get to the door, and then we can all escape this burning house. And there's another segment that's like, just let the shit burn. We're not going to make it out anyway. And so that's kind of where I think we are politically. And so I would say millennials are in a position to be able to recognize that things are wrong and do something about it. It's just, will they be able to do it before the far right does? And that's an open question.
So there's a red, blue, and green pill.
Yeah, that's actually, yeah, I would say so. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. I try to like inject some pop culture into this, you know?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate metaphor.
My last question is, does Generation Z have anything to worry about? Just a reminder, 1997 to 2012, their ages right now is 10 to 25.
I mean, Generation Z needs to band with the millennials. I mean, we should be a case study for the ravages of capitalism if it's allowed to exist, but not only exist, but just run completely unfettered. So I don't know what else we need to do besides be like, hey, look at us. Like, don't buy into this shit because look at where we ended up. It is not because of anything we did. It's because we were dealt this bad hand, and it's going to deal you a bad hand too. So it would behoove you to not allow yourself to be dealt that bad hand and rather recognize that if we start to think about in how we can essentially get out of it, you might be able to salvage a future. And it's not even a question of like economy. It's also questions of climate change and ecological issues. And so do we even want to have a planet 50 years from now? Then we better start doing something. And so I think that Generation Z I think for us, it was a little bit different because we're watching our parents who grew up during an era in which a lot of the things they do or did won't be able to apply to us. Whereas I think a lot of the things we're doing, we can be the test case or we can be the guinea pig and we can show you the way not to go and we can together figure out a way out of it. I don't think Generation Z has been infected with that ideology yet to where they can't be redeemed. And so I think if we catch them early, we can pull them towards our side. And so that's what I would say about Gen Z.
And you know what frustrates me about all of this? Like, we have so much responsibility as Gen Z and millennials, but it feels like the baby boomers are still in charge.
Yeah, I mean, look at Congress. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Just like 77.
It just sucks, but I feel like the baby boomers need to die in order for change to happen.
I mean, I think that's one component, but one thing I would caution against doing is romanticizing youth, because there's nothing inherently radical about being young. The issue is that you gotta catch people before they get too caught up into it, because once you start getting once you have too many tentacles into the system, it's going to be hard for you to pull out of it. I don't know why I keep using this. But anyway, so it's not just the youth thing. It's that you have to get people who haven't started to extract wealth or started to accumulate, get them to understand that the right strategy isn't if you can't beat them, join them, but that we should try to beat them. That's what you have to do.
Well, that is going to be the extent of our millennial conversation. I definitely learned a lot. What is the book recommendation?
Yes. So I think this is relevant for the conversation that we had today. So the book I recommend is called The Great Exception. So it essentially talks about how our parents' generation, so the baby boomers, were the exceptions to the rule. In other words, they were the generation that didn't get most of the ravages that our generation is suffering through and what previous generations before them had to suffer. And so as a result, like, they have these rose-tinted glasses of the world because they ended up being the exception that proved the rule. And so the author makes this case that we shouldn't think of our parents' generation as the standard. We should think of it as the exception. And then from there, start to say that, okay, well, they got all of these things, but they were the exception. They weren't that's not the way that America has generally functioned. And so I think that's important because a lot of people look back on that era to like glorify it. The author is like, nah, like, let's not glorify this. Let's try to look at all of the problematic ways of this generation and then start to think about, like, what does that mean moving forward? So I think it's relevant for this discussion.
I think it's crazy. You have a book for literally every topic. Like, it's almost like comparable to, like, there's a Nini meme for every emotion.
Listen, people, I mean, out here writing, so
right.
No need to wonder.
But yes, y'all, the book recommendation will be in the description below. Jared, where can they follow you?
Yes, so I can be found on Twitter or Instagram or both at JAYC Tiger Fan. And might I also add that I just began a Substack, which is a blog, where I am going to use that as a space to discuss political issues, but I'm going to try to do it in a way kind of like here that's very straightforward. Like, I won't use jargon or technical language. I'm going to try to use real life examples, pop culture references, those types of things. But I'm a writer, as Chris knows, like, this isn't my natural state. Like, I'm much more in my element when I'm writing. And so I'm going to use that as a space to kind of supplement a lot of the things that we're talking about here. So hopefully we can have a link to that and people can subscribe. And I'm going to try to have weekly posts. My first substantive post today was me trying to explain why the rent is so damn high. So
yes, the link will definitely be below in the description. Good luck with your dissertation.
Thank you. It's hard to believe, like, the next time we talk, I will be on the other side.
He took the words right out of my mouth. I was about to say, like, the next episode, he's going to be referred to as Dr. Jared Clemens. But yeah, I hope y'all enjoyed this conversation. I hope y'all, took away some knowledge from this. And please comment. Let us know what you think about this topic. With that, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and share. And we will see you for the next episode. Bye.